The nursing home in Montgomery, Alabama was quiet on the afternoon Margaret Chen arrived to interview its oldest resident. Margaret was a documentary filmmaker in her 30s, specializing in untold stories from American history. She'd driven 3 hours from Atlanta after receiving a mysterious phone call from the nursing home's director. "There's someone here you need to meet," the director had said. Her name is Ruth Walker. She's 103 years old, and she's been asking for someone to record her grandmother's story before she dies. Says it's important. Says it's something the world needs to know. Margaret had heard pitches like this before, elderly people wanting to preserve family histories that were meaningful to them but not necessarily historically significant. Still, something in the director's voice had compelled her to make the drive. Ruth Walker sat in a wheelchair by the window of her room, sunlight illuminating her weathered face. Despite her advanced age, her eyes were sharp and focused. She studied Margaret carefully as the younger woman entered. "You're the filmmaker," Ruth said. Not a question, a statement. "Yes, ma'am." "Margaret Chen. The director said you wanted to tell me a story." "Not just any story. The truth about my grandmother. The truth about what really happened in 1859. Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she reached for a wooden box on the table beside her. "Everyone thinks they know what happened at that auction. They wrote about it in newspapers, in history books. They called my grandmother the most expensive slave woman ever sold in Alabama. But they got it all wrong." Margaret pulled out her camera and recording equipment. "May I record this?" "That's why you're here, child. To record it. To make sure the truth gets told before I die and it's lost forever." Ruth opened the wooden box carefully, revealing old photographs, documents yellowed with age, and what looked like a small leather journal. My grandmother's name was Sarah. Sarah Crawford. And she wasn't what anyone thought she was. Margaret turned on her camera, adjusted the lighting, and nodded for Ruth to begin. "The auction was March 15, 1859, Ruth said, her voice growing stronger as she settled into the story. "Montgomery slave market, biggest crowd anyone had ever seen. The auctioneer was a man named Cyrus Whitfield, and he was promoting my grandmother like she was some kind of miracle. Said she had special abilities. Said she could predict things, see things other people couldn't see. Said wealthy men would pay a fortune for those abilities." Ruth pulled out a faded newspaper clipping from the box. The headline read, "Record-breaking sale, slave woman fetches unprecedented price. $15,000, Ruth said. "That's what Dr. Marcus Sheffield paid for her. $15,000 in 1859, that's worth more than $400,000 today. The highest price ever paid for a slave in Alabama history." Everyone thought Dr. Sheffield was crazy, paying that much for one woman. Margaret leaned forward, intrigued despite herself. What were these special abilities the auctioneer claimed she had? Ruth's expression turned complex, part pride, part pain. "They said she could predict death. That she could look at a person and know when they were going to die." The auctioneer had affidavits, sworn testimonies from doctors and plantation owners saying Sarah had made predictions that came true. 16 accurate predictions out of 17, all documented. Was it true? Could she really predict death? Ruth smiled slightly. That's the question everyone asked. And that's where everyone got the story wrong. She pulled out the leather journal, holding it carefully as if it were made of glass. "This was my grandmother's journal. She kept it hidden for 40 years, never showed it to anyone. She gave it to my mother on her deathbed in 1899, and my mother gave it to me before she died in 1955. I'm the last person alive who knows the truth." Margaret's camera captured every moment as Ruth opened the journal. The pages were filled with neat, careful handwriting, remarkable considering the writer had been an enslaved woman in the 1850s. My grandmother could read and write, Ruth said, answering Margaret's unspoken question. That alone was dangerous and illegal. But she could do more than that. She'd been trained in medicine, real medicine, not just folk remedies. A white doctor in Virginia, where she was born, had secretly taught her because he believed women of any race could be healers. She'd learned for 15 years, memorizing medical texts, understanding diseases, learning to diagnose and treat. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She began to understand where this story was going. So the predictions. Margaret started. Weren't predictions at all, Ruth finished. They were diagnoses. Medical diagnoses from a trained physician who happened to be enslaved. When someone asked Sarah if a person would die soon, she wasn't seeing the future, she was recognizing symptoms of terminal illness. Heart disease. Consumption. Cancer. Conditions that someone with medical training could identify but that most people of that era couldn't detect until it was too late. Ruth turned the pages of the journal, showing Margaret entries written in her grandmother's hand. Detailed observations about symptoms, diagnoses, prognosis. The journal of a doctor, not a mystic. But why? Margaret asked. Why create this deception? Why let people think she had supernatural powers? Ruth's expression hardened. Because my grandmother wasn't just a doctor. She was a soldier. A soldier in a war most people didn't even know was being fought. And the deception, the reputation as a prophet, was her weapon. She pulled out another document from the box, this one more recent, a letter dated 1958, written in shaky handwriting. This is from a man named Joseph Hartwell. He was 92 when he wrote this, one of the last survivors of the Underground Railroad network in Alabama. He wrote to my mother confirming what my grandmother had told her. Confirming the impossible secret. Margaret read the letter, her hands beginning to shake as she understood the implications. Sarah Crawford was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, Ruth said quietly. For 15 years, she helped enslaved people escape to freedom. But in 1859, the network in Virginia where she'd been operating was compromised. Federal agents were investigating. People were being arrested. Sarah knew she had to leave, but she also knew that the Underground Railroad desperately needed networks in the Deep South, in places like Alabama where fewer people were helping, where the journey to freedom was longer and more dangerous. Ruth paused, taking a sip of water before continuing. So she did something unprecedented. She created the reputation as a prophet. She spent 2 years building documentation of her supposed supernatural abilities. Some predictions were genuine medical diagnoses, others were manufactured with the help of abolitionists and sympathetic allies. The goal was to make herself so valuable, so unique, that she'd be sold to exactly the kind of owner she needed. Someone wealthy, Margaret said, understanding dawning. Someone with access and connections. Someone whose household wouldn't be heavily scrutinized. Exactly. Dr. Sheffield was perfect. As a doctor, he had legitimate reasons to travel around the region. As a respected member of Montgomery society, his household activities wouldn't be questioned. And as someone who prided himself on being a benevolent slave owner, he gave Sarah freedoms that a harsher master never would have. Ruth pulled out a map from the box, hand-drawn, showing routes through Alabama marked with tiny symbols. Within 6 months of arriving at the Sheffield plantation, my grandmother had established an underground railroad network in the Montgomery area. She used her role as a prophet to travel to different plantations, supposedly to make predictions about people's health and futures. But really, she was gathering intelligence, learning about security measures, identifying sympathetic allies, finding people who wanted to escape. Margaret's mind was reeling. The story was extraordinary, almost unbelievable. Yet the documentation was right there, the journal, the letters, the maps. Evidence of a secret so impossible that no one would have believed it if they'd been told in 1859. How many people did she help escape? Margaret asked. The records we have are incomplete. My grandmother had to destroy a lot of evidence to protect herself and the people she was helping. But based on what she told my mother, and what we've been able to verify through historical records, we estimate she helped at least 200 people escape from Alabama between 1859 and 1863. 200 people. 200 documented cases. There may have been more. Ruth's voice filled with emotion. And she did it all while maintaining her cover as a mystical prophet. She diagnosed real illnesses and called them predictions of death. She treated enslaved people with actual medicine but disguised it as folk remedies. She taught medical knowledge to others but framed it as superstition and traditional healing. Ruth pulled out a photograph, faded and cracked, showing a woman in her 60s standing proud and dignified. The woman's eyes held intelligence and strength that reached across the decades. This is my grandmother, taken in 1887. 22 years after slavery ended, 28 years after that auction. She lived to be 71 years old. She saw slavery end. She saw her children born free. She lived long enough to tell her daughter the truth about what she'd done. Ruth's voice cracked. But she never told anyone publicly. She kept the secret because even after slavery ended, even after the war, there were people who would have wanted to punish her. Former slave owners who'd lost their property because of her network. People who would have hurt her family for revenge. Why tell the story now? Margaret asked gently. After all these years, why reveal the secret? Ruth looked directly into the camera, her ancient eyes fierce and determined. Because my grandmother was a hero. She was a soldier who fought a war most people didn't acknowledge. She was a doctor who saved lives in secret. She was a liberator who risked everything to free people from bondage. And she's been written about in history books as just another enslaved woman, remarkable only because some white man paid a high price for her. That's wrong. That's injustice piled on top of injustice. Ruth reached out and gripped Margaret's hand with surprising strength. I'm 103 years old. I'm the last person alive who carries this truth. If I die without telling it, without making sure it's documented and known, then my grandmother's real legacy dies with me. She deserves better. All those people she saved deserve better. The truth deserves to be told. Margaret felt tears running down her face as she understood the weight of what was being entrusted to her. This wasn't just a family history. This was American history, hidden, secret, revolutionary history. I'll tell it, Margaret promised. I'll make sure everyone knows the truth about Sarah Crawford. Ruth nodded slowly, satisfied. Good. Because there's more. Much more. And some of it. She paused, her expression troubled. Some of it involves people who are still alive. Descendants of slave owners who profited from the system my grandmother fought against. People who still have power and wealth built on the suffering of enslaved people. People who won't want this truth to come out. Margaret felt a chill of apprehension. Are you saying this could be dangerous? I'm saying the truth is always dangerous to people who benefit from lies. Ruth's jaw set firmly. But it needs to be told anyway. My grandmother didn't risk her life for 40 years so the truth could stay buried forever. Over the next 3 hours, Ruth told Margaret everything. She showed her documents, photographs, maps, and letters. She read passages from her grandmother's journal describing escape routes, safe houses, and the elaborate system of signals and codes the network had used. She explained how Sarah had maintained her cover while organizing one of the most effective underground railroad networks in the Deep South. And she told Margaret about what happened when Sarah's secret was nearly discovered, about the dangers she'd faced, the people who'd died, the impossible choices she'd had to make. By the time Margaret left the nursing home that evening, her head was spinning with the enormity of what she'd learned. She had hours of footage, copies of documents, and a story that would change how people understood the Underground Railroad and resistance during slavery. But she also had a growing sense of unease. Ruth had been right, there were people who wouldn't want this story told. Families who still bore names connected to the slave trade. Institutions that had been built on slavery's profits. A society that preferred to think of enslaved people as passive victims rather than active resistors who'd fought sophisticated campaigns against their oppressors. As Margaret drove back to Atlanta that night, she kept thinking about Sarah Crawford standing on that auction block in 1859. Everyone had seen a valuable piece of property. No one had seen the soldier, the doctor, the conductor who was about to turn the Montgomery region into a battleground in the hidden war against slavery. The impossible secret was starting to come to light. And Margaret knew that telling this story would change everything, for the descendants of those Sarah had helped save, for the historical understanding of resistance during slavery, and for her own life as she took on the responsibility of bringing this truth to the world. The documentary she was about to make would be the most important work of her career. And possibly the most dangerous. But Margaret thought of Ruth's fierce determination, of Sarah's courage in risking everything to fight slavery, and she knew she had no choice. The truth had to be told. No matter what it cost. Margaret spent the next 3 months diving into research that would support Ruth Walker's extraordinary claims about her grandmother Sarah Crawford. She needed more than family stories and documents, she needed corroborating evidence that would convince skeptics and withstand academic scrutiny. What she found shocked her even more than the original story. In the National Archives in Washington, D.C., Margaret discovered records from the Freedmen's Bureau, the federal agency that had helped formerly enslaved people after the Civil War. Buried in files that hadn't been digitized yet, she found testimony from dozens of people who'd been helped by someone they called the Prophet of Montgomery. Their accounts matched Ruth's story perfectly. She told us routes to take, one testimony read. She gave us medicine for the journey. She knew things, about where patrols would be, which roads were watched, which houses were safe. We thought she had special sight. Later we understood she just knew more than anyone realized. Margaret also found something else, something that made her blood run cold. Confederate military records from 1862 showing that authorities had investigated organized slave escapes in the Montgomery region and had identified a possible ringleader matching Sarah's description. The investigation had been dropped suddenly with no explanation in the records. Why had it been dropped? Margaret needed to find out. She tracked down descendants of Dr. Marcus Sheffield, the man who'd purchased Sarah. His great-great-granddaughter, Helen Sheffield Morrison, lived in Birmingham. Margaret called and explained she was researching the history of slavery in Alabama and wanted to ask about family records. Helen agreed to meet, though she sounded wary on the phone. They met at a coffee shop in Birmingham. Helen was in her 60s, elegantly dressed, with the bearing of someone from an old, established family. She brought a box of documents with her. "I'm not sure how much help these will be," Helen said. Most of the plantation records were destroyed during the war or in fires afterward. "But I have some personal papers that belong to Dr. Sheffield, his journal, some letters." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she looked through the materials. And there, in Dr. Sheffield's own handwriting, she found confirmation of everything Ruth had told her. March 15, 1859, purchased the slave woman Sarah for $15,000. An enormous sum, but if her abilities prove genuine, she may be worth 10 times that. Catherine thinks I've lost my mind. Perhaps I have. June 3, 1859. Sarah has made 12 predictions in the past 2 months. 11 have proven accurate. I'm beginning to believe she truly has some kind of gift. The income from consulting fees has already recouped a third of my investment. October 18, 1861, Sarah asked permission to teach herbal medicine to the other slaves. I agreed. Healthier slaves are more productive. But Catherine worries this gives them too much knowledge. I told her not to be superstitious. What harm can folk remedies do? Margaret looked up at Helen, her heart pounding. Did Dr. Sheffield ever suspect what Sarah was really doing? Helen's expression was complicated. Keep reading. Margaret turned the page and found an entry from April 1862. April 17, 1862, they're gone. Nearly 50 slaves from Riverside left 4 nights ago, along with hundreds from other plantations in the region. The largest organized escape in Alabama history. Confederate authorities are investigating. They believe someone coordinated this, planned it, organized it. They suspect Sarah was involved. I don't want to believe it. I trusted her. I gave her freedoms most slaves never have. If she was deceiving me all along, if her gift was just a trick to gain access and information, I feel like a fool. But more than that, I feel betrayed. I thought we had an understanding, a relationship based on mutual benefit. Now I see I was just another obstacle she was working around. The authorities want to question her, but she's gone. Disappeared with the others. I've lost my entire investment and been made to look like a naive fool who couldn't control his own property. My reputation is destroyed. My business partnerships are suffering. All because I trusted her. Margaret closed the journal, her throat tight with emotion. What happened to Dr. Sheffield after this? Helen sighed. The plantation never recovered. He died in 1864, broken financially and emotionally. He'd been so proud of his enlightened approach to slavery, and having it all exposed as a carefully orchestrated deception devastated him. My family lost everything. I'm sorry, Margaret said, and meant it. Even though she knew Sarah had been fighting for freedom, even though she understood why the deception had been necessary, she could still feel sympathy for a man who'd been outmaneuvered and didn't understand he'd been fighting a war he hadn't even known existed. But Helen's next words surprised her. Don't be sorry, Helen said quietly. It's taken our family generations to understand this, but what happened to Dr. Sheffield was justice. He thought he was a good man because he didn't beat his slaves as harshly as some others did. But he still enslaved people. He still claimed ownership of human beings. Sarah Crawford was a hero who fought against that system, and she won. That's something to celebrate, not mourn. Margaret stared at Helen in surprise. You really believe that? I really do. About 15 years ago, I started doing serious research into my family's history. Not the sanitized version we've been telling ourselves, but the truth. I learned about the Underground Railroad network in Montgomery. I learned about the mass escape in 1862. I even found some letters from people who'd been enslaved at Riverside and who'd made it to freedom. They spoke about someone who'd helped them, someone they called the prophet, who'd taught them medicine, given them information, prepared them for escape. Helen pulled out a letter, carefully preserved in plastic. This was written in 1897 by a man named Joseph who'd been enslaved at Riverside. He tracked down Dr. Sheffield's son, my great-grandfather, and sent this letter. I found it when I was going through family papers. Margaret read the letter, tears forming as she took in the words. Dear Mr. Sheffield. I was born at your father's plantation. I lived there until I was 19 years old and escaped to freedom in 1862. I am writing to tell you about your father's slave woman Sarah, the one he paid so much money for. Your father thought Sarah had mystical powers. He thought she was special because she could predict death. But I know the truth. Sarah was a doctor, a real doctor who'd been trained in secret. She taught me and dozens of others about medicine, about healing, about how to care for ourselves and each other. She saved lives even while enslaved. She also saved my life in a different way. She helped me escape. She gave me information about routes and safe houses. She taught me how to navigate by the stars. Because of her, I made it to Ohio and then to Canada. Because of her, I've lived 43 years as a free man. I'm married, I have children, I've built a life that would have been impossible if I'd remained enslaved. I'm not writing to hurt you or your family. I'm writing because I want someone to know the truth about Sarah. She was the bravest, smartest, most dedicated person I've ever known. She risked her life every single day to help people like me. And she deserves to be remembered for what she really was, not as a mystical prophet, but as a freedom fighter. I hope this letter finds you well. I hope you can understand that what Sarah did wasn't about hurting your father. It was about saving people who desperately needed saving. Respectfully. Joseph Freeman, formerly Joseph of Riverside Plantation. Margaret's hands shook as she handed the letter back. This is extraordinary. This is exactly the kind of corroboration I need. There's more, Helen said. She pulled out a folder containing copies of documents. After I found Joseph's letter, I started searching for other records. I found testimony from 7 other people who'd been at Riverside and who credited Sarah with helping them escape. I found records showing the mass escape in 1862 was far more organized and sophisticated than historians have realized. And I found evidence that Confederate authorities had been investigating Sarah but that the investigation was shut down. Why was it shut down? Helen's expression darkened. That's where things get complicated. And dangerous. The investigation was stopped by someone high up in the Confederate government, someone whose family had a lot to lose if Sarah's network was exposed. Who? A man named Senator Harrison Blake. He owned 5 plantations and nearly 800 enslaved people. If Sarah's network became widely known, if enslaved people across the South realized that such organized resistance was possible, Blake and others like him would have faced mass escapes that would have destroyed the plantation economy. Helen leaned forward, her voice dropping. Margaret, the Blake family is still one of the most powerful families in Alabama. Blake Industries is a Fortune 500 company. They've spent 150 years building their reputation and rewriting their history. They present themselves as a family that's always been on the right side of history. But the truth is, their wealth was built on slavery, and they actively worked to suppress resistance and maintain the system. You're saying they wouldn't want this story told? I'm saying they've successfully buried it for over 150 years. They've donated millions to universities and museums to shape how Civil War history is taught. They've funded historians who present slavery in certain ways and marginalized scholars who've tried to tell more complete stories. If you make a documentary exposing the truth about Sarah Crawford and her network, you'll be challenging a narrative they've spent enormous resources to maintain. Margaret felt fear creeping up her spine, but also determination. Let them try to stop me. This story needs to be told. Helen nodded approvingly. I thought you'd say that. Which is why I want to help you. I have documents that prove the Blake family's involvement in suppressing information about the Underground Railroad. I have evidence of their efforts to shape historical narratives. And I have connections to other descendants of slave-owning families who've come to terms with the truth and want to see it acknowledged. Over the next hour, Helen laid out a network of people who could support Margaret's documentary, historians who'd been quietly researching this hidden history, descendants of freed people who had family stories that matched Sarah's timeline, and even some descendants of slave-owning families who were ready to face their own histories honestly. But you need to be careful, Helen warned as they prepared to part. The Blake family has a lot of power. They own newspapers, they have politicians in their pocket, and they're ruthless about protecting their reputation. If they find out what you're doing before the documentary is finished and released, they'll try to stop you. Legal threats, intimidation, whatever it takes. Margaret thanked Helen and returned to Atlanta with a car full of copied documents and a head full of plans. But she also felt the weight of what she was taking on. This wasn't just a historical documentary anymore. It was an exposure of how powerful families had shaped historical narratives to hide uncomfortable truths. She spent the next month conducting more interviews, gathering more evidence, and beginning to cut footage for the documentary. She titled it, The Impossible Secret, The True Story of Sarah Crawford. She also reached out to Ruth Walker multiple times, visiting the nursing home to share updates and ask additional questions. Ruth's health was declining. She was 103, after all, but her mind remained sharp, and she seemed energized by the knowledge that her grandmother's story would finally be told. "I can die in peace now," Ruth told Margaret during one visit. "I've carried this secret my whole life. Soon the whole world will know." But 2 days later, Margaret received a phone call that changed everything. Ruth Walker had died in her sleep. Margaret attended the funeral, a small service attended by a few distant relatives and nursing home staff. As she stood by the grave, she felt the full weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Ruth had trusted her with this story. Ruth had spent the last weeks of her life making sure Margaret had everything she needed to tell the truth. Now Margaret was the keeper of the secret. The last person who could ensure Sarah Crawford's legacy was preserved. After the funeral, one of Ruth's relatives approached Margaret. It was Ruth's great-nephew, a man in his 50s named David Walker. "Aunt Ruth left something for you," David said, handing Margaret an envelope. "She gave it to me a week ago and told me to make sure you got it after she died. She said you'd know what to do with it." Margaret opened the envelope. Inside was a key and a note in Ruth's shaky handwriting. "Margaret. If you're reading this, I'm gone. But the work isn't finished. This key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Montgomery. Box number 342. Inside you'll find documents I couldn't show you while I was alive, evidence that certain powerful families worked to suppress the truth about my grandmother's network. Evidence that they're still working to control how this history is told. Use it wisely. Use it carefully. But use it. The truth matters more than my safety did, and it matters more than yours does too. Finish the work. Tell the story. Make them face what their ancestors did and what they're still doing to hide it. Ruth Walker." Margaret stood in the cemetery, holding the key and note, and made a decision. She would finish this documentary. She would tell Sarah Crawford's story completely and honestly, no matter who tried to stop her. The impossible secret was about to be fully revealed. And justice, delayed for over 150 years, was about to be served. The safety deposit box contained documents that took Margaret's breath away. Confederate government memos showing deliberate suppression of information about organized slave escapes. Letters between plantation owners coordinating their response to Sarah's network. And most damning of all, records showing that Senator Harrison Blake had personally ordered the investigation into Sarah Crawford shut down, not to protect her, but to prevent public knowledge of her network from spreading to other enslaved people. There were also financial records showing that the Blake family had paid substantial sums to historians and institutions over the decades to ensure certain aspects of Alabama slavery history remained obscure or were presented in specific ways. They'd been engaged in a century-long campaign to control the narrative. Margaret knew this evidence was explosive. It proved not just what Sarah Crawford had done, but also how powerful families had worked to erase that history and protect their reputations. She was editing footage for the documentary one evening in her Atlanta apartment when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Margaret Chin. A man's voice, smooth and professional. Yes, who is this? My name is Robert Harrison Blake III. I'm the CEO of Blake Industries. I understand you're working on a documentary about slavery in Alabama. Margaret's blood ran cold. How did he know about her project? She'd been careful, working quietly, not publicizing what she was doing. I'm working on several projects, she said carefully. What's your interest? Ms. Chen, let's not play games. I know you've been researching my family's history. I know you've spoken with Helen Sheffield Morrison and obtained documents from Ruth Walker before she died. And I know you've accessed records that my family has worked very hard to keep private. Those records are part of the public historical record, Mr. Blake. I have every right to use them. Legally, perhaps. But I'm calling to suggest that producing this documentary would be a mistake. Not a legal mistake, necessarily, but a career mistake. Blake Industries has close relationships with every major streaming service and television network. We advertise extensively. We sponsor cultural programs. I'm sure you understand how these relationships work. The threat was clear even though it was never stated explicitly. If Margaret made this documentary, Blake Industries would use its corporate power to ensure it never got distributed. No network or streaming service would touch it if it meant losing Blake's advertising dollars. Are you threatening me, Mr. Blake? I'm offering you an opportunity, Ms. Chen. My family is prepared to make a substantial donation to create a proper, scholarly, balanced documentary about Alabama history. We'd want you to direct it, naturally. Your fee would be quite generous. 6 figures for a year's work. All we ask is that you approach the subject with appropriate nuance and balance rather than sensationalism. Margaret felt rage building in her chest. By balance, you mean covering up what your family did. Hiding the truth about how you suppressed information about the Underground Railroad. Protecting the reputation you've built on blood money from slavery. Blake's voice turned cold. I'd be very careful about making accusations you can't prove, Ms. Chen. Defamation lawsuits can be quite costly. I can prove everything I'm going to say. I have documents, testimonies, records from your own family's papers. The truth is coming out whether you like it or not. Then you're making a very foolish decision. You'll finish your little documentary and find that no one will distribute it. You'll spend years working on something that will never be seen. Meanwhile, your reputation in the industry will be destroyed. People will say you're difficult to work with, that you're biased, that you can't be trusted to handle historical subjects professionally. Your career will be over. I'll put it online myself if I have to. YouTube, social media, wherever I can. Blake laughed coldly. And reach what? A few thousand people. Meanwhile, the authoritative version of this history, the one my family sponsors, will be seen by millions through proper distribution channels. We control the narrative, Ms. Chen. We've controlled it for over a century. One stubborn documentary filmmaker isn't going to change that. The call ended, leaving Margaret shaking with anger and fear. Blake was right about the power dynamics. She was one person with limited resources going up against a corporate empire with unlimited money and connections. But she thought about Sarah Crawford risking her life every day to fight slavery. She thought about Ruth Walker trusting her with the truth. She thought about all the people who'd been erased from history because powerful families had rewritten it to suit their needs. She couldn't give up now. Margaret reached out to her network of independent filmmakers, historians, and activists. She explained what she'd found and what she was up against. To her surprise and relief, many offered to help. Scholars offered to appear in the documentary and provide expert testimony. Other filmmakers offered technical assistance. Civil rights organizations offered to help with distribution and publicity. 3 months later, Margaret completed The Impossible Secret, the true story of Sarah Crawford. The documentary was 90 minutes long, meticulously researched and documented, combining Ruth's testimony, historical records, contemporary interviews, and dramatized reenactments of key moments in Sarah's story. But Blake had been right about one thing: no major network or streaming service would touch it. Margaret submitted it to festivals, pitched it to distributors, reached out to every contact she had in the industry. Everyone was interested until they heard about the content and the people it implicated. Then doors closed, calls weren't returned, and polite rejection emails arrived. Margaret was preparing to release the documentary herself on YouTube when she received an unexpected phone call. It was from Helen Sheffield Morrison. "Margaret, I heard you're having trouble getting distribution." That's an understatement. "The Blake family has effectively blacklisted me. I thought they might. Which is why I've been making some calls of my own." "Do you know Walter Morrison?" Margaret's breath caught. Walter Morrison was one of the most respected journalists in America, a retired Navy veteran turned investigative reporter who'd won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for exposing corporate corruption and government cover-ups. He was in his 70s now but still influential, with a reputation for taking on powerful interests and winning. "I know who he is," Margaret said carefully. "He's my cousin. I sent him a rough cut of your documentary. He called me this morning. He wants to meet with you." 2 days later, Margaret sat across from Walter Morrison in his home office in Washington, D.C. Morrison was a tall, lean man with silver hair and sharp eyes that had seen too much injustice. He'd watched the entire documentary before Margaret arrived. "This is important work," Morrison said without preamble. "It's also dangerous work, which is why the Blake family is trying to bury it. But I've been taking on dangerous stories for 40 years. I'm not going to stop now." "What are you suggesting?" Margaret asked. "I have a documentary series on PBS. Uncovered, the stories they don't want you to know. We expose corporate corruption, historical cover-ups, abuses of power. Your film about Sarah Crawford fits perfectly. PBS is publicly funded, they don't depend on corporate advertising the way commercial networks do. The Blake family can't threaten them economically." Margaret felt hope surging for the first time in weeks. "You'd distribute my documentary through your series?" "With your permission, yes. We'd present it as a special episode. I'd do an introduction explaining the significance and why certain powerful interests tried to suppress it. That framing is important. It shows viewers that the documentary itself was controversial and threatened, which makes the content more credible and compelling." "When could it air?" Morrison smiled. "How about next month? Right during Black History Month. Maximum visibility, perfect timing. The Blake family won't be able to stop it, and once it's aired on PBS, other distributors will feel safe picking it up for streaming and international distribution." Margaret wanted to cry with relief. "Thank you. You have no idea what this means." "I think I do," Morrison said quietly. "I was Navy for 20 years before I became a journalist. I fought in Vietnam. I saw people risk everything for what they believed was right. Sarah Crawford was that kind of warrior, fighting a different kind of war, but a warrior nonetheless. Her story deserves to be told. And the people who've tried to suppress it deserve to be exposed." The documentary aired on February 15, 2024, almost exactly 165 years after Sarah Crawford had been sold at auction in Montgomery. PBS promoted it heavily, and Morrison's introduction laid out the stakes clearly. What you're about to see is a story that powerful people have tried to keep hidden for over 150 years. It's the story of Sarah Crawford, an enslaved woman who fought slavery from within using intelligence, courage, and a sophisticated deception that made her one of the most effective Underground Railroad conductors in American history. It's also the story of how wealthy families have worked for generations to control historical narratives and protect their reputations. This documentary was completed despite threats and intimidation. The filmmaker, Margaret Chen, was told her career would be destroyed if she continued this work. She continued anyway, because the truth matters more than corporate power or family reputations. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, the documentary had been viewed by over 3 million people on PBS's streaming platform. Social media exploded with discussions about Sarah Crawford and the Underground Railroad network she'd built. Historians who'd been quietly researching similar stories came forward with their own findings, corroborating and expanding on Margaret's work. The Blake family tried to respond, issuing a statement calling the documentary biased and historically questionable. But their statement only drew more attention to the film, and independent historians quickly validated Margaret's research and conclusions. 3 days after the broadcast, Margaret received dozens of messages from descendants of people Sarah Crawford had helped escape. They'd been carrying their own family stories for generations, stories about an enslaved woman who'd helped their ancestors reach freedom, stories they'd never been able to fully verify until now. One message particularly moved Margaret. It was from a woman named Jennifer Freeman, a professor of history at Howard University. "My great-great-great-grandfather was Joseph Freeman, the man who wrote the letter to the Sheffield family in 1897. Our family has always known he was helped by someone he called the Prophet, but we never knew her real name or the full story of what she did. Thank you for giving us back our history. Thank you for honoring the woman who saved my ancestor's life and made my entire family's existence possible." Margaret also heard from scholars who'd been trying to tell similar stories about other Underground Railroad conductors whose work had been hidden or minimized. The documentary sparked a broader conversation about how slavery-era history had been sanitized and controlled, and how many stories of resistance and courage had been deliberately erased. But the most satisfying response came 3 weeks after the broadcast. Blake Industries announced that Robert Harrison Blake III was stepping down as CEO, to pursue other interests. Shortly after, the company issued a formal statement acknowledging their family's role in slavery and their subsequent efforts to control historical narratives. "We recognize that our company was built on wealth derived from slavery, and that subsequent generations of our family have worked to obscure this history rather than confront it honestly. We apologize for these efforts to suppress the truth. We are establishing a foundation dedicated to supporting accurate historical scholarship about slavery and resistance, with a particular focus on stories that have been marginalized or hidden. The foundation would be funded with $50 million from the Blake family fortune, a small fraction of their wealth, but a meaningful acknowledgement nevertheless." Margaret knew this wasn't complete justice. The Blake family would remain wealthy and powerful. The centuries of suffering caused by slavery couldn't be undone. But it was something, an admission, an acknowledgement, a small step toward truth and accountability. 6 months after the documentary aired, Margaret returned to Montgomery, Alabama. She'd been invited to speak at a symposium on slavery and resistance at Alabama State University. But before the symposium, she had something else she needed to do. She drove to the old Montgomery slave market, now preserved as a historical site. Standing where Sarah Crawford had stood in 1859, Margaret thought about everything she'd learned over the past year. Sarah had been mocked and underestimated, seen as just another enslaved woman with supposed supernatural abilities. She'd faced cruelty and injustice every day of her enslaved life. But she'd risen with courage and resilience, turning the very system that oppressed her into a weapon against slavery itself. Margaret pulled out her phone and called Helen Sheffield Morrison, who'd become a close friend over the past months. "I'm at the slave market," Margaret said. "Standing where your ancestor bought Sarah Crawford." "I'm glad you're there," Helen replied. "You know what I think whenever I think about that auction?" "What?" "Everyone there thought they were witnessing a business transaction, one man buying a valuable piece of property. They had no idea they were actually witnessing a soldier entering enemy territory. They had no idea Sarah Crawford had just positioned herself perfectly to wage war against everything they believed in. Margaret smiled. She fooled them all. She did. And 165 years later, she's finally getting the recognition she deserves. Her story is being taught in schools now. Young people are learning about her courage and intelligence. The history books are being rewritten to include her and hundreds of others like her. That's justice, Margaret. Delayed, incomplete, but real. After the call ended, Margaret stood for a long time at the site of the auction block, thinking about Sarah Crawford and Ruth Walker and all the people who'd carried these stories for generations, waiting for the day when the truth could finally be told safely. The impossible secret had been revealed. Justice had been served, not perfectly, but meaningfully. And Sarah Crawford, enslaved, sold, underestimated, and written out of history, had finally taken her rightful place as one of the great heroes of American resistance. Margaret looked up at the Alabama sky, and she could almost feel Ruth Walker smiling somewhere, satisfied that the work was finally done. The truth was out. The secret was shared. The story was told. And it would never be hidden again. Asterisk note, this story is fiction inspired by the real courage of Underground Railroad conductors and enslaved people who risked everything to fight for freedom. While Sarah Crawford is a fictional character, her story represents the countless unnamed heroes who resisted slavery through intelligence, courage, and sophisticated organizing that has often been erased from history. Asterisk.